Let's take a look at some of the areas that as an auditor will consider to be a system-related area of concern. This is where we're going to be concerned with these following areas as they could indicate potential problems. When we see that the IT staff is not responding to queries in a timely way, well, that could partially be a staff issue, but also it could be a system issue. Is our system being run at maximum capacity? That we see, for example, that when a query is put in by a customer service rep, the customer service application is very slow to respond because we don't have adequate bandwidth, we don't have adequate processing capability, and so therefore we have not properly managed then and forecast what do we need in bandwidth, processing power, in storage, to make sure that our systems can continue to respond in a timely way to business requirements. Equipment gets old, and for many organizations today, this is a problem. We've been using computers now for over 20 years, and a lot of that equipment has sat there quietly working away, and in many cases unnoticed. Whereas laptops and desktops have been replaced, sometimes the equipment sitting in the racks in the server room, and nobody's even looked at it, or in some cases, nobody even knows what that equipment does anymore. This is where we have the aging of our equipment. We sometimes have a lack of maintenance and a lack of patching. We realize that all equipment has what we'll call a mean time between failure. The mean time between failure, or MTBF, is then the estimate from the vendor of the lifespan of that equipment. For example, all hard drives have a certain lifespan. After a while, that mechanical device, the hard drive, is just going to get tired and not want to spin anymore. That means that the data is not going to be accessible. And if I don't have a backup of that hard drive, it could mean the loss of that data or an extremely expensive recovery effort. So we need to look at where do we have equipment that's already getting a little bit old and tired. Make sure we have replacement plans. This is where it's important as an auditor. We review network diagrams, system diagrams, our configuration management database, and we identify what equipment is in there, its age, and of course whether or not it is. Well, for one, in some cases we find we don't even have a declared owner anymore. That system was put in, and the people that originally put it in have moved on. There's no one really that owns that equipment now and is making sure that it's being looked after. When we walk into a server room as an auditor, we should be able to check and see, is there clear ownership that everybody knows what is this server being used for? What is this equipment being used for? When was the last time the UPS was checked and maintained? Is the UPS even adequate to support the systems if the power went out? We also have to look at things such as we could have a situation where equipment now is really well beyond its life expectancy, and we don't even have then proper backups and so on for it. So if that equipment failed, we wouldn't even have a way in some cases to rebuild it. Equipment requires maintenance. In some cases that can be anything from cleaning of fans, of course, so it gets proper ventilation, to of course proper patching and just making sure that our equipment is then being maintained so it's more likely to continue to operate correctly. In many cases, we have equipment that may not be supported any longer by the vendor. If I have an older Microsoft operating system, for example, that could very much be an unsupported system, or we could have unsupported applications where maybe we bought a product from a vendor and that vendor isn't even, may have been bought out. That vendor may, of course, have closed down, and there's nobody that can provide support for that application anymore. So as an auditor, we should check what applications do we have and make sure that those applications are, of course, we do have support for them. One of the things we'll sometimes do if we've bought software, especially from a smaller vendor, is we'll require that vendor to give us a copy of the source code. And if the vendor doesn't want to do that because they consider that to be their intellectual property, then we'll have an agreement with them that they must keep that source code in escrow. In other words, they have to keep a copy of the source code with a trusted third party. So if the vendor went out of business, or the vendor was unable to provide the support we require for that software, we could get a copy of that source code for our own purposes to be able to maintain it and keep our systems running and maintained. One area we see is as we're going more and more these days into virtual machines. We see a proliferation of virtual machines all over the place and images that in some cases nobody even knows what these are being used for. The whole idea of asset management, tracking what assets we have, is really an important area of responsible IT operations. We'll also look for the types of errors we're having. We can look at the logs overnight of what problems we've had, what jobs have failed. We can look at where hardware, software errors keep coming in. This could indicate a lack of proper maintenance. It could indicate that an emerging problem, and in some cases the need then to be prepared to replace or in some cases do recoding of that software.